Okay, welcome back to Plato's Cave. With me today, I have Garrett Pendergraft. Garrett is a professor of philosophy at the Seaver College at Pepperdine University, and he has written a really interesting book from what I've read of it so far. It's called Free Will and Human Agency, 50 Puzzles, Paradoxes, and Thought Experiments, which will be released in just a very short time in July of 2022. So Garrett, thanks for talking to me.
Thank you, Jordan. It's great to be here. I appreciate your interest in the book.
Yeah, it looks, you gave me the kind of bootlegged version of it. And it looks, I don't know how long the final book will actually be. You know, I've got it kind of printed out from the PDF, but
yeah.
Honestly, it seems like I was, reviewing like a few chapters besides the ones that we're going to talk about. And it looks like an amazing kind of introductory book if you're either getting into or maybe sort of starting to advance like within the free will and moral responsibility topic. How long's the final copy going to be?
Yeah, so the final manuscript was, I think, about 75,000 words. So between the 50 chapters, each one is anywhere from 1,000, maybe 1,100 words to about 1,500 words. A couple went a little bit over that. So yeah, we were trying to make it an engaging introduction to the field, sort of a, I don't know, like a bottom-up introduction, where you just sort of dive right into some of these examples and thought experiments, and not go into too much detail about them, but just enough to get a sense of the issues and how they intersect with some of the contemporary conversations, and then kind of move on to the next one. So yeah, it's kind of relatively speaking, kind of a fast-moving book, but yeah, it was a lot of fun to write.
Yeah, and it has a really cool and I think unique setup. I haven't really read a book like this where you sort of for each of the 50 either paradoxes or puzzles or thought experiments, you kind of like have a block page or two where you introduce the idea or the puzzle or whatever, and then you also provide several responses to it, and then recommended readings to kind of follow up on, which is it's actually really cool because you get to kind of just if you read through the book, you can pick out like what areas or kind of individual problems you find interesting. And then it's just like, okay, bam, here's 3 or 4 papers to continue reading. I really like that idea.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's definitely the goal. And that's something that the publisher, that Routledge, is trying to do with this series, is provide something that's useful for maybe a senior seminar at the undergraduate level, but could also be useful even at the graduate level, or even someone who's just trying to kind of get a lay of the land after having worked in a different field. Because if you're familiar with the thought experiment already, you can just sort of gloss over the setup, and then you can look and see some of the main responses to it in the literature. And then the recommended reading is, it's I think a really valuable part of being a student is having solid, but also limited recommendations for sort of what to read next. It's nice to have this huge annotated bibliography, but if you're kind of getting started, it's like, well, here's 100 different sources. I'm not sure which one to start with. Do I start with the most recent, the oldest, or do I try to look at citation numbers? And so I think having a handful, I think it ends up being, usually it's about 3. I think maybe in a couple chapters, there's 6 recommended reading pieces. Sometimes it's a recommended viewing or listening, so a movie or maybe a podcast episode. But that's the goal, is for those who, if a particular chapter is really engaging or exciting, then the reader can immediately move on to read the next thing, and then from there kind of open up and pursue the topic as they want. And then also there's a lot of cross references too, because the chapters are so short. There's going to be some overlap, and there's several issues that kind of get brought up in a couple of different chapters. And so that's something too, where you can kind of follow a train through the book and bounce around chapters if you'd like.
Yeah, we were talking before recording about sort of getting into philosophy, and neither one of us had an undergrad background in philosophy. So I'm curious, what drew you to philosophy generally, but also specifically to agency, philosophy of action, free will?
Yeah, so my undergraduate degree was in computer science. I wanted to work in visual effects in the film industry, which I did for a few years and enjoyed it. It was great, but I had been, as I was finishing up my undergrad, I'd become more interested primarily in issues around philosophy of religion and philosophical theology, and those kinds of questions. And I was, that was still sort of always in the back of my mind. I was doing some reading on the side, and ran into a master's program that I could do part-time while I was working full-time. And then actually sort of swapped that and stayed working part-time while I switched over to full-time graduate school, and the rest is history. But I think it was really just a lot of it has to do with just the issues in philosophy of religion that I was interested in. A lot of them have to do with obviously arguments for and against God's existence, but also to questions about how some of the theological doctrines, the traditional ones, sort of interact with kind of our common sense view of ourselves as human creatures. And so a lot of that is really just touches upon agency. Another area that is obviously relevant there is philosophy of mind. And as I just kind of gravitated towards some of the questions about free will and more responsibility, and I really appreciated the kind of the tensions that were inherent in some of these doctrines. And of course, they show up in theology, but they also show up in science, whether it's the hard sciences or the social sciences. And so that kind of, our best science or our best theology tells us one thing, but our common sense and maybe some of our philosophical reasoning tells us another. Throw in some divine revelation with some additional confounding elements, and you get you get a lot of really interesting puzzles and tensions. So it's always drawn me in. I actually, as we were briefly discussing, I was studying in graduate school to more toward epistemology. I was trying to think of a way to kind of combine my interests in epistemology and agency for a dissertation, but ended up transferring graduate schools, and then the place I ended up, UC Riverside, was such a good place to do agency that I just kind of put all my focus in that area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I mean, I really relate to that in a lot of ways, because it's such a I don't know, it's like such an area of philosophy with so much gravity. Like, you always get just kind of sucked back into that area, and it flares up when discussing other areas of philosophy. So the chapters that we're going to be talking about are chapters 1, 6, and 8 of the book. And I picked those out just because, I mean, obviously the whole book seems extremely interesting, but I've been doing some reading, kind of summer reading about existentialism generally, and these were part of the subsection that focused on sources of existential angst. So I figured that these would be kind of, related to questions that were percolating at the top of my mind. So I guess we can kind of move through them one at a time. The first chapter is called The Garden of Forking Paths, which is a callback to Borges's great short story. If people haven't read it, they absolutely should. And in that story, I guess, Borges kind of introduces this idea, and, this is in the zeitgeist to a large extent, this idea that we sort of have, paths that are laid out before us that are multitudinous and branching, and we can choose one of those. And when we choose one, Borges says we kind of sever the possibilities of going into any of the other ones. So you introduce this as, if I'm correct, sort of it's at least a psychological way to think about free will, but also a metaphysical one, right?
Yeah, right. And by the way, it was great to, was very familiar with this notion. Once it came to mind, the Garden of Forking Paths, Borges's notion. And once it sort of came to mind, it was clear this has to be the way to start the book. It's just such the common sense view. And that's really, as you mentioned, that's the idea, is that I think most people, not everyone, but most people, if they sort of had to come up with a metaphor, it would be something like this. Or if they were given a lineup of metaphors, they would gravitate toward the Forking Paths metaphor. So it's I would say a lot of, and I think it was John Martin Fisher who kind of brought the Borges idea into the literature as the common sense view, as the starting point, I think and a lot of people are happy to not just view that as the way we see our own choices from an internal perspective, but also as just the way the world is set up. They a lot of times people talk about free will as having more than one future that's physically possible, given your past and the laws of nature or things like that. So I think it's a common sense view, and then there are a lot of and this is of course primarily an incompatibilist picture, but for most a lot of philosophers are happy to just work out the metaphysical details of how this forking paths metaphor might work. That's kind of how they approach it, and others will want to resist that as being an actual sort of one-to-one correspondence between what we do and or what we perceive and what actually happens out there. And so that's part of the interest, I think, is just really thinking about how far we can take this picture. As I mentioned, the chapter, Van Wagon acknowledges that it's just a picture, doesn't, just like, so it sort of touches it kind of touches and it hints at some of these questions between realism and anti-realism in science and stuff like that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it definitely, whenever you first kind of read that, I remember even assignments in early grade school, maybe like fourth or fifth grade or whatever. And there would, it would literally be like, kind of writing assignments where you would talk about, kind of imagine a possible course for your life. And even, at such a young age, it's like, it's very intuitive to think of, okay, it's just like how we think about, planning a career, like planning a life, planning whatever. There's, you're beginning to kind of like advance through school or whatever. And it seems like you could go into any number of paths. So those are open to you in some sense. And then you kind of have to choose the path that you go down. And it definitely strikes me as a very psychologically accurate picture, I guess. So the one thing that, because Fisher talks about guidance control and regulative control. And I was sort of thinking about that in the context of the paths. And I mean, if you sort of buy determinism generally, it does seem as though, you weren't really free to do otherwise in some sense, where, the path that you choose, it's sort of like you only get to choose one path, right? Mm-hmm. But you do, I mean, so you talk about, Robert Cain says that like this picture of the world, psychologically speaking, almost has to be integral to what it means to be a person. Almost, you almost have to. I don't like this phrasing necessarily, but you almost have to live as if more than one path is open to you, and to fail to sort of make a choice in any scenario is a choice itself. So it seems like no matter what, you said it's kind of is amenable to an incompatibilist reading, and that seems definitely true on a metaphysical level, but I also think that on a psychological level, this is just sort of how you have to think about things because you don't know the future in some sense.
Yeah, no, I think one way to view the situation is to look at the psychological perspective, which really is, I think, essential to personhood and to the way we view ourselves. You can kind of look at that as the data. And so the data set is the set of all of our deliberative interactions, deliberative engagements, all the moments in which we are sort of projecting forward and directing ourselves in one of multiple directions, down one of multiple different paths. And so I think that's the sort of phenomenology of agency, some have called it. That's the data, and we can't. Yeah, I don't think it's possible. At least, of course, this touches on chapter 6 as well. But in the grand, or at least typically, we have to see things as open in order to kind of put ourselves in the right frame of mind to make a choice. And then the question is just, all right, well, how do we explain that data? And there's one sense in which the simplest explanation is that, well, the reason why it seems like we have these multiple paths open to us is because we actually do in some sense. And then, so that's kind of the libertarian explanation of the data. But there are definitely compatibilist explanations of the data that, that are, I guess, minimalist in a different way. And they say, well, we consistent with various kinds of of scientific theories or even theological doctrines, we can still undertake this kind of deliberation and this kind of choice making, even if, strictly speaking, the future isn't open in a way that it seems to be. And so, yeah, I think you're exactly right that our perception of traversing this garden path is pretty much essential to personhood and certainly to agency. And the question is just, given that we do perceive things that way, and that's kind of how we operate, how do we explain that? And does our explanation have to respect that metaphor fully, or can it sort of, allow for a little bit of slippage maybe between what's actually going on? I think you can, obviously, straightforward explanations are great. On the other hand, there's certain, I think we've all sort of experienced, as philosophers, but also just as regular people, that perception can be misleading. And so I think that there's lots to latch onto if you're trying to make the case for either explanation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it made me think. So I had just finished reading Sartre's work about, this sort of like, he talks about there's almost this unlimited, in some sense. Sartre thinks that we have like a deep agency in the world. And kind of, tabling that for a second, it did, just reading him, it made me think about how many paths are actually kind of genuinely open to you, in the sense that they're not precluded by the laws of physics, or they're not kind of practically impossible. So, there's like a very basic retort that someone could have to the libertarian. It's like, okay, well, why don't you just choose to fly? Well, that's obviously libertarians aren't asserting that humans, if they just had enough willpower, could just levitate or whatever, right?
Right.
But it's actually true, though, that like when you're in any given situation, there are just way more possible courses of action than we tend to believe. Like, we are having this conversation right now, and the normal thing to do is continue having the conversation, but it's literally open to me to just move the mouse and click end the call if I wanted to, right? And it's also, I can just I could do anything. I could do any number of things right now. And it does seem like there is a I don't know, it just strikes me that there's kind of popularizers of incompatibilism, hard determinists specifically, like not philosophers, but kind of general, like maybe it's like a Jerry Coyne-ish type of person, who definitely seem to, it's not that they don't believe that that's the case, but they definitely seem to under highlight it when they're talking about things, because even if you couldn't have done otherwise, that really plays almost no role in sort of forward-looking psychological approaches, I guess. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah. Well, it kind of reminds me of one of the other chapters, which has to do with whether incompatibilism or compatibilism is sort of the default or the intuitive perspective. And this is one that the experimental philosophers haven't decided yet, or they haven't come to an agreement. There's been some good progress and some interesting developments on that question. I think that the jury's still out on it, but I think it is relevant to, a lot of times those who, especially those who deny free will in sort of a contemptuous or sneering kind of way. Not saying that, I'm not attributing that view to any particular individual, but there's definitely, I would say the hard determinists who come to their determinism maybe more on the basis of science as opposed to philosophy, can be a little bit sneering in their rejection of free will. And a lot of times it's because they view it as this magical ability that we all think we have or something, and so they want to disabuse the benighted masses of their notions of free will. And I think, but then when you give the average person, usually these are college students, so I don't know how average college students are, but you give these people little vignettes that are just, ordinary actions, and they're described as being completely caused, or there's sort of some sort of rollbacks and replay scenario where the same thing happens over and over again. They still, at least, in a lot of the studies, they still tend to judge that the person was responsible, whether the action was positive or negative or neutral. And again, there are debunking explanations of this, so that's not just to settle the issue about what the sort of the intuitive view, and maybe in the end it doesn't really matter what the intuitive view is. Maybe there is no intuitive view, but I think I think that's one issue, or one intriguing facet of this whole debate. As you mentioned, it comes up in so many different contexts, and the way, if we're at like our answer to the question, a free will relevant question or a more responsibility relevant question, is really going to depend on the other details of the context. It's going to depend on what sorts of things are salient. It's going to depend on, kind of how are we being forced to think of the kaleidoscope of possibilities that accompany every second, or are we just kind of thinking about big picture decisions that change the course of our life? And so, I think it's really, that's part of the interest, I think, in the issue, is just that there's so many legitimate ways of conceiving of a free choice, and of what it means to have alternatives, and of what it means to have some sort of leeway among those alternatives. And really, so you have to be very careful. And that's one reason why it's helpful to look at a bunch of different cases and thought experiments, just because depending on how you set it up, you could change one thing and it can really influence our perception of whether or not this individual is free or responsible or blameworthy or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've definitely been persuaded to I do think that the lay intuition, or sort of the pre-philosophical intuition, I do think it skews libertarian, in the sense that, like, when you just have conversations with people, I feel like there is an intrinsic idea there that sort of metaphysically people really could have done otherwise. It's not sort of spelled out in any great detail. But it also seems like, I've kind of been persuaded by some of Susan Wolf's work, but also Galen Strawson's, that it's actually like not I don't even think that libertarian free will is a free will worth wanting, to use Dennett's term, where it seems like, it's this sort of like desire to kind of have your cake and eat it too, in the sense that you want to, kind of act as you are, act within your character, but also be free to choose anything. And those two, I think, Wolf puts it in one of her papers, it's just like, you're if you actually do desire like contra-causal free will, you almost are desiring something incoherent, where you want to love your wife, but be free to also not love her. And it's just sort of like, why is that a freedom worth wanting? So I almost think that the whole debate about, this is obviously annoying to libertarians, but I just don't think that is the interesting part of the debate there. It's sort of what types of local agency, or in Fisher's view, guidance control, do we really have, and sort of what situations are more corruptive of that or not?
Yeah, I think there is a really important and fundamental question, which is sort of what is it that you really want here? And obviously, there's no guarantee that what you want is the way things are going to be, but I do think that's a useful exercise, is to take a particular conception of free will, sort of dial it up to 11, and just ask, okay, are we in a better spot now? Or is there something sort of shocking or horrific about that? And that's that's part of what's going on in, I guess it's chapter 25, which is considering these two conceptions. There's the ability to do otherwise, the more choices, the better. And then there's, which is, I think, a natural view, as you said, and as Wolf says, there's maybe something a little bit, maybe it's some incoherence sort of lurking there somewhere. So actually in that chapter appeal to some work from Barry Schwartz. Maybe you've heard of the paradox of choice, right? And so as we as we have more and more options, there's sort of something, it makes it harder actually for us to make a choice. That's a psychological point, not a metaphysical point, but there is something there. It's like, well, you would think that if there was something deeply and fundamentally superior about more choices, that we would also experience that goodness as the choices proliferate. And you know, and maybe not. Maybe there's a huge difference between you know, one option and two, and then beyond two it's just sort of diminishing returns. Maybe that's the way it is. But you know, the alternative conception is this idea that what's more valuable is the ability to choose the good, or to do the right thing. You know, and so that chapter has some cases about being able to you know, I don't think if you were choosing where to go to college, if you're choosing what to have for dinner, if you're, you know, choosing what kinds of hobbies to pursue, you'd like a few options, but it's not like you want 100. You know, when the menu is, you know, is 100 pages, then it's just, I think it's obvious that it's paralyzing and not that much fun. And so you dial that up to 11 and it becomes a little bit less attractive. And then I think it's interesting question. I think intuitions really differ on this. So take something like you know, moral perfection. I use an example of playing a musical instrument, performing a piece in a competition or a recital. If you there, maybe the goal is to play it perfectly with no mistakes. Maybe the goal is to, you know, the goal that we're all kind of working toward and will never achieve is moral perfection, and always making the right choice, or even just practical wisdom. And so there, dial that up so that not only do we always make the right choice, the best choice, play the right note, but we actually can't, you know, and you can imagine that we somehow cultivated ourselves into a way that we can't, or you can imagine that we were going to be given the choice to, you know, so God comes down and says, hey, would you like to be perfect or not? You know, your call. And so you sort of make the choice to be perfect. Now, putting it that way opens up questions about the kind of historical component and whether responsibility traces back to that. But I think if you just look at the extremes, you can ask, well, you know, and I ask my students a lot of times, would you prefer to never be able to make a mistake, whether as a musician or an athlete or a moral, you know, moral agent? And you know, not everyone agrees. I mean, to me, that's an attractive point. I would sort of take that deal if offered. You know, the ability to screw up is not one that's very valuable to me. But I think for some, they would see it as valuable. So yeah, a lot of it has to do with what it is that you want when you are, as you're going through the world and making choices.
That's so interesting. I completely have the other intuition where I would totally choose the ability to screw up still. It like it reminded me of the Borges quote. I might butcher it, but he says, if I was given the choice between truth or the search for truth, I would choose the search every time. It might be with respect to the Library of Babel. I don't remember what story that was, but
okay, yeah.
That's so interesting. It just, for whatever reason, I have like the very inescapable intuition that being able to, like, not being able to fail almost takes like the fun out of something. Like if I in learning anything, you know, picking up a new sport, like the whole, like over the past couple of years, I've gotten into golf recently, and
Yeah.
it's just like, if you couldn't hit a bad shot, I don't know what the value of any given shot is. But when it's like you put in a ton of practice and you narrow kind of the range of your misses, you know, then when you actually just, you know, flush like an iron shot, it's like, okay, that was perfect. And it's only valuable because it could have been worse, or sort of like, you know, it's weird. Like I'm definitely, and maybe this is just kind of like idiosyncratic to me, but it also is, it's not fun to play a board game if you can't win or lose, for me, you know? So I wonder if that is it. Yeah, that's so interesting. What percentage of people do you think, or like in your classes, have chosen?
If I recall, I mean, it's probably, I do think that it's probably 30% would opt for the
Okay.
perfection as I pitch it, maybe. So it is a minority. And
Okay.
I agree with you. If the choice were, um, well, you can kind of hack around out there and get gradually better and have some moments of bliss, but mostly just struggle. Description of my golf game. Then or you can just plug into the matrix and get the golf module installed, and then you'll be be a perfect golfer. Yeah, I do agree that there's something much more satisfying about getting better. I guess what I'm imagining is the so every golfer or anybody who's working towards something is working toward that perfect endpoint. And what I'm imagining is someone who is pretty far along the path and has already, and maybe I'm cheating by doing this, but I'm imagining someone who's already sort of gotten themselves to a pretty good threshold. And then the option is, okay, now that you've worked at this for a while, do you want to just keep working at it? Or would you like to just sort of complete the process and close that gap? And so, and I think also too, there are, I don't know, this is maybe getting too speculative, but there could be ways of like with golf, just to continue that example, there's enough there where maybe the perfection is going to be in the, maybe you are able to repeat your swing path the same time every time. But there's so much terrain and there are conditions and just other sorts of things that, I still think your scores would be incredible, but it wouldn't be like your, hole in one every time, as I think Kim Jong-il, there was a press release one where
Yeah. Scored
he
like a 36.
yeah,
Yeah.
or something like that, with multiple holes in one on 18 holes. But anyway, it wouldn't be like that, as I imagine it. And the same thing with and I can imagine too. Yeah, there's different ways if you're imagining performing a musical instrument, performing a piano piece. There's not hitting any notes wrong, which is in one sense perfection. But then of course there's a lot that goes beyond that in terms of actually playing the piece well. So I think if you, a lot of it, which kind of go back to an earlier point, that a lot of it is about what you're holding fixed and how you're telling the story. And I think if it's no work, just immediate perfection versus kind of the fighting the good fight out there on the golf course, then the fighting the good fight is much more satisfying. But I think there are ways of working, the ways of working up to a goal. And at that point you would say, you know what, I'm not really interested in having the alternative of flubbing this shot or making the wrong choice. And what that tells me is that, the thing I value the most is actually a certain type of performance, as opposed to just having alternatives. So and I think you do need to have a trajectory. That's important. There needs to be some sort of narrative, for example, that moves toward that perfection. But the question is, when it comes down to it, as you're sort of approaching that endpoint, would you want to just would you sort of want to hang on to that possibility of error, or would you like to go ahead and cross over into perfection, having worked toward it? And I think that the answer to that question can kind of indicate, some pretty deep intuitions about free will.
Yeah, definitely. I think that pretty nicely leads into chapter 6, actually. And so chapter 6 is discussing the question of whether deliberation requires uncertainty, which I actually kind of took that question for granted in a lot of ways before reading this chapter. But basically, is it Carl? Is it Genet? Is that how you pronounce it?
Genet.
Genet. Okay.
Yep.
I should have gotten that, having read a bunch of French existentialist literature.
Oh yeah. Well, it's hard to, you never know whether to go for that pronunciation or just stick with the bland
Stay
American
safe.
pronunciation.
Yeah. So Genet is, you say, one of those who thinks that deliberation requires uncertainty. So if you could just kind of, what does he mean there, generally speaking?
Yeah, so Genet and Richard Taylor and others are of the mindset, which they take to be the common sense, and actually they take it to be sort of unavoidable, the view that there's something essential about not knowing what you're going to do um, while you're deliberating about what to do. And so they say, look, if you know that that you're going to if you already know you're going to go golfing this afternoon, then there's really nothing to deliberate about. It would just be a sham, as they describe it, or a farce. It's just sort of like conceptually necessary that you be unsure about what's going to happen while you're deliberating. And then as soon as you decide, then that uncertainty goes away. And so you can still think about it and revisit your decision. But if the decision still stands, then it doesn't count as deliberation.
Mm.
And if it does count as deliberation, then you must have sort of reopened the decision or sort of taken back the decision. So I just think that it's kind of two sides of the same coin. Deliberation and uncertainty about the future are just kind of necessary concomitants. So that's their view. If you know if there's a choice that you're looking at and you already know whether or not you're going to make it, then it's impossible to deliberate about it.
Yeah. So I definitely found myself drawn to Genet's kind of, default view, he might call it. But I was thinking about, I mean, I don't know what percentage of the time you think that you kind of deliberate for a significant amount of time. I don't think I think I'm on the lower side of the bell curve of deliberation about things. Like I usually I almost find myself having chosen in some sense. Um, like, for instance, the choice to move from engineering industry to philosophy. The choice there was almost kind of like I almost kind of realized I had made the choice in the process of researching programs, you know what I mean? And sort of like preparing to, I was like, oh, there wasn't sort of like a moment where I deliberated and then decided. But um, it goes back to your point about too many choices actually being something we don't want. I was accepted to multiple master's programs, and there was a lot of deliberation that went on there because there's a lot of incommensurate, factors about that, whether it's stipend or location or faculty or placement rate or all those things, right? So I actually do think that I deliberated even after deciding on Houston in some sense. I think, because I had Excel sheets and I had notes and I talked to like multiple people from every department and everything. And, I had to cross like a bunch off the list and it came down to like a final couple. And I do think that I'm just trying to kind of like introspectively recall what that was like. I kind of do think that I had made my mind up on Houston and then went through the charade for a few days of, well, let's just not make the decision yet, even though it was made. But I think that's a very uncommon experience for me. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I do. I mean, I think you describing it as a charade is kind of telling, because I think Janae and Taylor and others would agree that
Mm.
you were going through the motions, but on the assumption that you already had made the decision, which you can only sort of realize in retrospect, because there isn't always that sort of crystal clear moment where the decision has been made. But I think. I take the same approach a lot of times. I'm a big believer in the back burner, where I just figuratively put, I think about whether to do something or what the right choice is. I really have no idea. So I just sort of put it on the back burner. I tell my mind to work on it. And then I hope for the best, or at least I set it aside for, 24 hours or 72 hours or whatever. And a lot of times when I revisit it, sometimes I won't even consciously revisit it. I'll just sort of realize that the decision has been made, or that all the materials necessary are there now. And other times I'll sort of come back to it and the back burner will have done its work. And so I do think a lot of times, so not only are there a lot of choices that are either minimally or not at all deliberative. A lot of those happen, and then of the ones that are, a lot of them are sort of passively deliberative, and so it is rare that you're actually consciously weighing the reasons. Usually it requires writing something down to be an actual case of deliberation. But I think I think the one of the claim in this chapter is that even though that is what we all experience and how things typically go, what the chapter wants to do, actually taking inspiration from Taylor himself, who thinks that deliberation does require uncertainty, but just to recognize that, well, there's the practical side of a choice and there's the epistemic side of a choice. So there's knowing what you're going to do, and there's settling what you're going to do, or you might call it epistemic settling and practical settling. And in the vast majority of cases, those come together. The way that you learn what you're going to do is by deciding to do it, or just by doing. And oftentimes too, maybe you've had this experience where you think you've made a choice, or let's put it this way: you think you're torn, and so you decide to flip a coin, right?
Yeah.
And then you flip the coin, and it comes up whatever it comes up, and you realize, oh no, I don't want that choice. So actually you thought you were torn, you really weren't torn, you didn't realize that you had a strong preference, and it was the prospect of the other choice that went against your unknown preferences that sort of brought those to the forefront. And so I think that's something where we can learn, that just helps sort of, I think, drive a wedge between our decision and our knowledge of what we're going to do. And if that's a real distinction, which I think it is, then why couldn't you? It would be hard. So the case of the coin flip is one where you've basically settled it. Practically speaking, you've made the decision, or like you described earlier, you had kind of already, you were still deliberating, but basically the decision had already been made. And so you had settled it. Practically speaking, deliberation was over, but for whatever reason, it hadn't been epistemically settled for you. You're still trying to figure out what you're going to do, even though you'd already decided. And so I think that that's a great example, the one you gave, of how these can come apart, where the practical settling comes first, and then it's only later that you actually learn what it is that you decided. And it's strange to talk about it that way, but I think that's just sort of the way we're built. But then if it can come apart in that direction, well, why couldn't you come to learn what you're going to do before you've decided what you're going to do? Obviously, you can't come to learn what you're going to do by deciding before deciding. Can't do that. That's impossible. But you can learn some other way. And so I give some examples of just testimonial knowledge, or kind of inductive knowledge. And you can just imagine, look, there's all kinds of ways of you could even try a time travel case here. That's maybe a little bit more contentious and controversial, but it just seems like there are various ways of learning what you're going to do, and nothing about that learning process somehow limits you from deliberating and weighing, because deliberating is just weighing the reasons for and against a particular choice. And usually it's unsettled both practically and epistemically what we're going to do before we make the choice, but there's no in principle reason why it couldn't be epistemically settled, but you could still go through the deliberative process, or at least that's what the chapter wants to argue.
Yeah, no, I totally bought your distinction there. And it also seems like the inferential way of epistemically kind of settling, that struck me as very flimsy, I guess, in the sense that it doesn't really appear as though you do know. You give the example of sort of, you're like settling a case, and there's like a bunch of settlements that have gone before you, and they all settle in the positive direction. And so, you have like some good reason to believe you're the last person to settle. Well, you'll probably just follow other people. I'm skeptical of that as like a like if someone claimed that was knowledge of what you would do, I'm very, very skeptical that that's a meaningful claim to make, in the sense that until you have decided, like I wonder if I do think it's like it is really all about the deciding. The epistemic aspect of that seems so opaque to us. And if it happens to be right, which we probably are, we know ourselves pretty well, so we happen to be right about it a lot, but that's not really the core of where the information or the knowledge is.
Yeah. So in the class action lawsuit, you imagine 1,000 other plaintiffs in the class go in and hear the terms of the offer, and they accept it. And so, in the chapter, I claim that would give you reason to believe, strong enough reason that it counts as knowledge, that you'll accept it as well. And you could, and in defense of that, I might say, well, if you, at a certain point, like if it were just someone else, and you knew this was an ordinary person who had no special interest in the case, and then you go and see everyone from 1 to 1,000 accept the terms, then I think you do have knowledge that this other person's going to accept. And so the question would be, well, what's different about your own case? Well, maybe it's like you said, it's because you're on the inside of it that sort of blocks this, what would be enough evidence for knowledge, sort of makes it no longer enough evidence for knowledge. And so I guess I think that's something that's definitely open for someone to argue. And I think that's maybe one way of putting the complaint is that Janae and Taylor, there's no attempt to argue along those lines, so it's sort of like, it's more just kind of, it almost functions as sort of a claim of conceptual necessity that's just sort of a primitive, and then there's an example given to illustrate it, and that's enough. And so, yeah, I would be open to an argument that there's something fundamentally different about the internal perspective, so that if you're, if you see 1,000 people accepting the terms, then you still can't come to know that you will, if you haven't decided yet. Or if someone really well, a best friend or a spouse tells you that you're going to accept it. Normally, testimonial knowledge from someone who knows you really well would be good enough for knowledge, maybe not in this case. And so I guess I'm open to that. I guess it would just be, what is it about the first person case that's different? Because it seems like we can describe it as in the same terms, like the individual deliberating has no special interest in the case. There's sort of nothing about it that would lead anyone to believe that his choice would be any different from anyone else's, so then you sort of just start knocking down the dominoes and then ask, well, what's he going to decide? And so, yeah, I think that's kind of, I think, a really great place to the sort of more work needs to be done is, are there certain kind of evidence paths that could give us knowledge in a third personal way, but can't? There's something sort of that's impossible for them to deliver knowledge in a first personal way. And maybe, so maybe there is, so this connection between epistemic settling and practical settling, I think that there's a lot to be explored there in that connection.
Mm-hmm. I'm realizing it. I also might just be kind of making a semantic quibble there, because it's like the thought that I had is almost like, well, you don't really know that you will make a choice one way or another until you've made the choice. But like you said, I mean, people, we know people really well. Like, you can predict with a high degree of accuracy what people will do. And obviously people includes yourself. So maybe it's just, semantic.
Well, that actually could be a nice way of reconciling the two views here, is to say, well, look, those who said deliberation is impossible without uncertainty, what they really should have said was that deliberation is impossible once you know what you're going to do. And so then you can sort of say that there's some wiggle room here in the strength of your epistemic position with respect to this future choice. And so maybe there's, maybe knowledge is, so, and I describe it in the chapter in terms of certainty, and it's typically, the requirement is typically laid out as, well, actually, I guess I kind of shift back and forth in the chapter. I sort of articulate the requirement in terms of knowledge, but then I mentioned, so I sort of, and so there's maybe room room to wiggle there as well, because yeah, I mean, it could be that um, you have to be in a certain state of uncertainty, but maybe that could count as knowledge, or maybe maybe vice versa. So I think there's there's a room to kind of think about how these different concepts interact with each other in these kinds of deliberative circumstances.
Yeah, definitely. Um, okay, so with the time we have left, let's get to chapter 8, because I definitely had a few questions about the debate about whether divine foreknowledge undermines our freedom or not.
Yeah.
So you reference some work by, is it Zagzebski? I always mess up. Yeah, Zagzebski.
Linda
Yes,
Zagzebski. Uh-huh. Yep.
That's right. Is she at Northern Illinois? Is that
so she was at Oklahoma for a long
that's
time.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
And I think she has gone emeritus at Oklahoma.
Okay. Yes, I think you're totally right there.
Yeah, or maybe she's just about to, but yeah, so
okay.
Yeah, I think she's had a named chair at Oklahoma for a while. And
That's right. I listened to her on the Free Will show. They interviewed her. Yeah. Okay, so if you could maybe just in kind of somewhat at the level of detail that you think is required, essentially, what is the problem of divine foreknowledge for freedom? And then I definitely have some questions about that.
Yeah, sure. So, and I do, Zagzebski wrote the entry for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on this issue, and I think did a really nice job of regimenting the argument. And so in this chapter, I kind of offer a simplified version of that, and I try to isolate the different ingredients. And essentially, it's just, you've got the necessity of the past is one important ingredient. And the idea is that, well, if you are going to do something, then God in the past has always believed that you were going to do that thing, because God's omniscient, knows all truths. So pick anything that you're going to do. It was true before you were born. That you're, and maybe you're sort of already bristling at that point, but it seems like the way omniscience works is God somehow has knowledge of the future, and not just the future, but everything in the future. And so essentially, whatever mechanism God uses to have those beliefs, they're always there. And so go back to any arbitrary time in the past, and God had a belief that you would do something. Zagzebski uses example of picking up the phone. And then, so that's one element, is just that because God is omniscient, and because arguably there are truths already out there about what we're going to do, then God's going to believe them. And then God is supposed to also be infallible in his omniscience. And so there you get a necessity of, there's sort of this necessary correspondence between what God believes and what actually happens. And then there's this sort of somewhat complex, but I think intuitive principle called a transfer of necessity principle. And the idea is that if you have something that's necessary, and that sort of necessarily leads to another thing, well, then the second thing is also necessary. And so here the leading to is going to be a logical relation, like implication. So if, and there, because God's supposed to be infallible, then him believing something necessarily implies that thing was true. So you've got this necessary belief in the past, necessary now because we can't do anything about it, it's stuck in the past. And then you've got this necessary connection between that belief and what actually happens. And so then you just sort of transfer that necessity to the thing itself that you're about to do. And if it's necessary that you're going to do it, then it seems like it can't be free. And so that's the basic idea, is you just got some belief in the past, it's stuck in the past, nothing anybody can do about it, and it's necessary. There's sort of necessary connection between that belief and what happens in the future. And so you just sort of transfer the necessity along, and you end up with what's called theological fatalism as opposed to logical fatalism.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I've listened to a few conversations about this, and I don't know, I'll venture a thought, and I want to hear what you think about it. So it always seems like the it just strikes me that there might be something missing in the way in which God has divine foreknowledge. So it strikes me that, like, if we're talking about sort of the classical um, idea of God, he's kind of got three main attributes in some sense. He is omnipresent, so he exists everywhere. He's omniscient, so he knows everything, as you said. But then importantly, he's also omnipotent, so he can do anything, or he has the power to do anything. And it always strikes me that the way in which God's knowledge is infallible is precisely because he's omnipotent. So, the reason why, and you talk about like how people kind of quibble with this, but the first premise is that, let's say that God believed T. T is just a proposition where something will happen. So, it strikes me that the reason why he's infallible in his belief there is because he was the one, is the one who's responsible for that being true. So it seems to undermine any sense of agency, but only when you add that sort of condition of omnipotence there, because it seems to, the way that you laid it out, it seems to vitiate leeway compatibilism pretty heavily there, because it kind of removes the idea that you could have done otherwise, because if God believed this and you walked through the entailment principle there, right, it sort of had to be the case. But when you add omnipotence on top, it seems to vitiate the kind of control that agents kind of locally have as well, because it's just because precisely the nature by which God has infallible foreknowledge. Has that view sort of been kind of put forth by anyone in the debate?
Well, there's definitely a lot of important intersections between you could also describe it as an account of divine providence and an account of divine foreknowledge or divine omniscience.
Okay.
And you're right that, so for example, although it doesn't, I don't talk about it a lot in this chapter, but one of the historically, especially contemporarily popular responses to the argument is the Molinist response, which says that there are all of these counterfactuals that are true about us. So if we were in certain circumstances, we would choose to do one thing or another. And if the circumstances are right, then we would choose to do it freely. And so what God does, he knows all these counterfactuals and he kind of actualizes a set of them. And so he sort of gets what he wants by looking at what we would do in certain circumstances, and then just actualizes the set of circumstances that produces the best combination of outcomes. And so that's often put forward as a solution to the problem of theological fatalism, because, well, what God knows is that if we were in certain circumstances, we would do such and such freely. And so you sort of smuggle in the freedom, that's putting it contentiously, but you build in the freedom into the consequent of the counterfactual. And so God can know everything that we're going to do, but what he knows is that we're going to do certain things freely in certain circumstances. And then, of course, there may be certain actions that he might want to bring about, but he can't, because there's no circumstance in which we would freely do it, or maybe those circumstances in which we do it would bring about some other stuff that is, unacceptable. So anyway, I bring that up because that's sometimes one critique of that response to the argument is that, well, that's a really sort of comprehensive and interesting picture of divine providence, but it's still, it's not clear. If you look at the argument there, it's not clear exactly which premise it's calling into question. And so I think if you are trying to preserve some leeway, then I think one of the best strategies is the Occamist route, or you can sort of strip it down to just the core of it, which is counterfactual dependence. So you can say, look, God knows everything, God can do everything, properly sort of articulated or properly understood, and we can do otherwise. And if we were to do otherwise, then God would have had some other belief in the past. And so there's no issue with so that there's a an epistemic problem if God gets surprised, and then but there's also a power problem if God's intentions are violated or falsified, or if just his beliefs are falsified, then that's kind of a power, not so much a power issue for him, but not something that we're supposed to be able to do.
Mhm.
And so the counterfactual dependence idea kind of tries to address both of those, because it says, well, look, some things we can do, some things we can't. Sometimes we have alternatives, sometimes we don't. But the key thing is that because of this way that, because of God's infallibility, if you go into a different possible world where we do something else, well, in that world, God's beliefs still track the truth of what we do, if you want to put it in truth tracking terms. And so it's kind of like, so God's beliefs have this counterfactual dependence on what we do. And and then you can still say, look, if anything that God wants to make happen, he can still make happen. But he's also sort of the way he forms beliefs, but what we're going to do, whatever that is, if it's even legitimate to talk about God having beliefs, the way he does that has this counterfactual sensitivity to what actually happens, so that there's never any issue of falsifying a belief, or somehow violating God's omnipotence.
Yeah, that response, I almost question if it's almost a vacuous claim, where it seems to sort of be like tautological in some sense, where it's sort of saying, okay, well, it's almost defining whatever happened as the belief God would have had to have had. And I wonder, like, it's coherent, obviously, but I don't know that it kind of illuminates anything about the debate. It's just almost sort of defining whatever. Yeah, it's just defining God's foreknowledge as matching the counterfactual in a way in which I almost wonder if that seems to put pressure on his omnipotence, in the sense that, I don't know, it's like, counterfactuals almost don't seem to make sense in an omnipotent God case, because, you said kind of before, like, well, if things would have gone differently for me in this way, could have affected this person in another way, right? But that seems to be almost contingent on things having to go some way, where we're helpless but to kind of succumb to the way the world works, for lack of a better term. But if God really was omnipotent, then there's almost, I don't know, then that connection could be separable, or could be severed. So I don't know. It definitely struck me as a way out that I don't know helps anyone in the debate. But also, when you add that premise of omnipotence, it seems to put pressure on that in a weird way.
Yeah, so it's true that Ochimism or counterfactual dependence is not going to be really an account. It's not going to give you a satisfying account of any divine attributes or any human capacities. And so you're right that it can only go so far. It is a way of denying the first premise of the argument. So the first premise is just that this belief that God had in the past is necessary. It's fixed back there in the past, and nobody can do anything about it. And the reason why you can't do otherwise is because your doing otherwise would require reaching back and altering that thing that's fixed.
Yeah.
And so counterfactual dependence is sort of a minimal, all that it can do, if anything, is give us reason to doubt the fixity of that belief back in the past. You say what the Occamist or what the counterfactual dependence proponent says is, no, you don't have to reach back and change anything, because good news, God's beliefs are special, and they're infallible, and they exhibit this kind of counterfactual dependence. And so some things you can do, some things you can't. That's a separate question, right? We're not going to settle that in this debate. But the point is just there's no special reason arising from divine omniscience. And you're right about omnipotence. Like there are certain things we can't do because they would sort of butt up against the divine attributes in a way that that rules it out for us. And that's still going to be true. And so and this is kind of this I think is maybe a typical compatibilist, maybe like a David Lewis style compatibilist move, and say, look, you tell me what we can and can't do, or when we do and do not have alternatives. Like, let's just pick a common sense set. So like when I'm rolling down a hill, I have no alternatives. But when I'm walking up a hill, I do have alternatives. Let's just fix on a set. And then the point is that now if we overlay divine omniscience on top of that, that's not going to further restrict the scope of what we can do. Because all the alternatives that we agreed upon having are still open to us. It's just there's this funky connection. So if you have a belief, or if I have a belief of what someone's going to do, they can act in surprising ways, and they can falsify my belief. And so my beliefs are stuck in the past. If I formulate one now and then someone acts contrary to it in the future, then it's just that belief I had in the past didn't become false. Well, maybe it did, but the point is that it was false. It was violated. And the cool thing about God's beliefs, now it's not like, this is important too, it's not like when we do otherwise, we sort of, again, we don't reach back and change God's belief. It's that, well, there's the actual world where certain things happen. We make certain choices. And the question is, at any given moment, any given choice point, can we do something that would, in a sense, put us in another world? So there's the actual way things go. I suppose that depending on your view about time and the open future, you might disagree that there's an actual way things are going to go. But if there is, then being able to do otherwise means that this other world is accessible to you. And in that other world, you do something differently, and God has a different belief. So there's no single world where you're like changing God's beliefs. There's no single world where you were going to do one thing, but then you do a different thing instead. You just always do what you're going to do. And God always believes that it was going to happen. But when we talk about alternatives and about God's beliefs, well, we go to these other worlds and we notice that they have these features, which we call counterfactual dependence.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'm going to check out the recommended readings for sure about this.
Yeah, good.
Do you I don't know if you know off the top of your head, but do any of either like the recommended readings here, or just anything off the top of your head, do people, you mentioned Divine Providence and David Lewis, does anyone kind of directly address freedom or agency from the perspective of including God's omnipotence?
Well, there's Tom Flint, I think back in the 90s, maybe early 2000s, wrote a book sort of fleshing out the Molinist view of providence.
Okay.
I think it's just called Divine Providence, the Molinist account. And so that's a comprehensive treatment of the Molinist view of providence. And then there are other alternative accounts that are maybe more Thomistic or might be more sort of just straight up theological. But the Flint book is a good place to start because that's the full account, and then within that account he tries to explain how it solves this problem. Whereas a lot of what I recommend in this chapter is just starting with the argument for theological incompatibilism. But yeah, it's an interesting debate because there are some people who are just focused on, well, here's the argument and here's a reason to reject one of the premises. But then there are others who actually want to provide an account and say a little bit more. And so in some ways it kind of parallels some of the stuff in maybe the responding to the problem of evil. Are you just trying to sort of fend off the argument, or sort of a defense, or are you trying to actually provide a full explanation? For someone who wants to know why things are the way they are you trying to answer that in more of a theodicy?
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that's the correct analogy for sure. Well, I know, yeah, so we're definitely over an hour of recording, at least so from what I've read, and I can't imagine the rest of the book differs. I will say to the audience, I highly recommend, especially for people who either just kind of like you said, university, undergrad level, or like getting into a grad program. I think this is a perfect book for someone like me, for instance. I can't recommend it enough. It's a very nice kind of package of information and further reading in each chapter. So
thank you, Jordan. I appreciate your reading it and the recommendation for sure. So I'm glad you found it to be fruitful.
Yeah, of course. And so before we end, you're on Twitter. Is that kind of the best way to get into contact with you and to follow your work?
Yeah, probably so. I'm trying to be a little bit better about posting more regularly on Twitter and including more kind of items from the book. I did post over the spring. I kind of posted this mega thread of one tweet per chapter. Just, of course, you can only summarize so much in a tweet. But so I'm going to try to be putting more stuff from the book there on Twitter, and so that's a great place to start. I have a pretty sort of standard university faculty page and stuff too. I don't really have the greatest web presence. One of the many things I need to be working on. But yeah, Twitter's a great place to start.
Yeah, definitely. If only you had perfect freedom of the will with respect to
Indeed,
your online presence.
Given that choice, I would have a perfect Twitter presence, whatever that may be. I shudder to think, actually.
Yeah, there are definitely menial chores like that I would, insofar as like posting as a chore, there are definitely things in that realm where I would choose to have perfect abilities, but it's because I'm not interested in it.
Yeah, right. Just to tell me the things to post. So let's say 20 to 30 minutes a day, the perfect things to post for maximum impact. I would sign up for that in a heartbeat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Maybe that's called having a social media manager. I don't know.
Maybe, but I think that can go pretty wrong too sometimes.
That's true.
All right, Garrett, stay on the line for a second if you would, but thank you so much for talking with me. And again, I can't recommend the book enough.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
So if you want to support this show, keep it going, help it grow, you can share it on social media or Twitter specifically. You can rate it on Apple Podcasts, like or subscribe via YouTube or your RSS feed. And you can also get in contact with me. You can email me at platoscavepodcast@gmail.com and follow me on Twitter at Jordan_C_Myers. And as always, thank you for listening and keep struggling to escape the cave.